When engineering thought gives birth to a truly ingenious design, time loses its power over it. The military aircraft of the U.S. Air Force and Navy have proven this perfectly, having been in service for a decade despite the development of technology, changing strategies, and the advent of more modern aircraft. Some of them began their service during the Cold War, witnessing the fall of the Berlin Wall, surviving presidential successions, and serving in several wars. So who are they, these permanent sky fighters? The first one on our list is the Lockheed U-2, the star of the U.S. Air Force, successfully operated by the CIA since the 1950s. In fact, both organizations used the services of this legendary reconnaissance aircraft, but it was the CIA that had a controlling interest in the project, codenamed Dragon Lady. This, in fact, is where the nickname of this aircraft came from. In 1953, the Air Force began studying proposals for an aircraft that could reach an altitude of 70,000 feet and fly about 3,000 miles without refueling. Meanwhile, the best interceptor fighters in the Soviets' arsenal could only reach 54,000 feet, and the lion's share of radar systems could not track targets above 65,000 feet. Additionally, the aircraft would have cameras that could take images with a resolution of 2.5 feet at an altitude of 60,000 feet. No camera of that time could cope with this task, so Lockheed had contracts to manufacture a series of custom cameras from astronomer and optical systems designer James Gilbert Baker, as well as Richard Scott Perkin, co-founder of Perkin-Elmer, a precision optics company. The U-2's first flight took place in August of 1955 on a dry lake bed in Nevada that the CIA and Lockheed Skunk Works nicknamed Watertown. Today, it's better known to us as Area 51. Nuclear test sites with active aircraft munitions testing sites around them, coupled with the remote location, provided an ideal place to hide the new prototype from prying eyes. The design of the aircraft was so risky that test pilots even discovered what they nicknamed the Coffin Corner, a 6-knot range in which the Dragon Lady could function normally at 70,000 feet. If the pilot slowed down, the engines could stall, and if he accelerated, he risked that the plane would fall apart. However, this didn't stop the U-2 from successfully spying on the USSR, taking part in conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as several multinational NATO operations, building a resume no less unique than that of the SR-71 Blackbird. Despite plans to retire the Dragon Lady back in 2014, replacing it with RQ-4 Global Hawk drones, the latter still falls short of the impressive performance of the U-2, which is capable of carrying heavier and more advanced sensors and is cheaper to operate. But American aviation is not famous for only its scouts. The Lockheed C-130 Hercules is perhaps the most famous military transport aircraft on our planet, becoming the 5th aircraft to celebrate 50 years of continuous service in the United States Air Force, and the longest produced military aircraft, reaching 70 years of production in 2024. After the Korean War, World War II piston transport aircraft remained out of service, so the U.S. Air Force issued a general operating requirement for a new transport aircraft in 1951. Unlike vehicles developed from passenger airliners, the C-130 was designed as a combat transport with loading from a hinged loading ramp at the rear fuselage. Another advantage was the choice in favor of Allison T-56 turboprop engines, which guaranteed it a much longer flight range than aircraft with turbojet installations due to lower fuel consumption. Yes, this giant looks awkward next to the F-35 Lightning II jet fighters, but what it lacks in grace, it makes up for in tenacity. Interestingly enough, like the U-2, it also served the CIA as an intelligence gathering tool. For example, in 1969, the agency's C-130E dropped sensor pallets near China's Lopner nuclear weapons test facility to obtain information about China's nuclear capabilities. And a little earlier, in 1963, Hercules set and still holds the record as the largest and heaviest aircraft ever to land on an aircraft carrier. Although the heavily armed combat version of the AC-130 has become a cult favorite, especially for fans of the Call of Duty games, the most popular model is, and still remains the cargo C-130. Furthermore, over time, the role of this legend has expanded significantly. It became not just a transporter of people and goods with a payload of 42,000 pounds, but also an infantry support combat vehicle, and even a hurricane hunter led by meteorologists. Speaking of tankers, it'd be unfair to leave out the American military refueling aircraft K-135 Stratotanker, developed by Boeing based on their own Boeing 367-80 and Boeing 707 airliner. This one provides essential aerial refueling capabilities for the U.S. Air Force and has served that role well for nearly 70 years, with no plans to retire until the 2030s. Although the KC-135 was initially purchased to support Strategic Air Command (SAC) bombers by the late 1960s in the Southeast Asian Theater of Operations, the Stratotanker's capabilities as a means of enhancing combat effectiveness were not at the forefront. In-flight refueling of F-105 and F-4 fighter bombers, as well as B-52 heavy bombers, allowed the latter to greatly increase the radius of destruction for their targets, and fighters could carry out missions on the front line for hours rather than several minutes, as was often the case due to high fuel consumption. With a maximum takeoff weight of up to 322,500 pounds, it's especially impressive that 200,000 pounds is the fuel capacity of this giant alone. And nearly all of the internal fuel can be transferred via the tanker's flying boom, the KC-135's primary transfer method. A boom operator stationed in the rear of the aircraft controls the boom while lying prone, viewing through a window at the bottom of the tail. A special shuttlecock-shaped shuttle attached to a flying rod and pulled behind it can be used to refuel aircraft equipped with probes. Simply put, with the support of even one such tanker, you're practically flying with your own gas station. Since we're talking about the giants of aviation, we mustn't forget about the old Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, which first took to the skies back in 1952 and has been reliably protecting its homeland from enemies for more than 70 years. Since its inception, the B-52 design has evolved regularly from the straight-wing Model 462 with 6 Wright T-35 turboprop engines, a total weight of 360,000 pounds, and a combat radius of 3,110 miles, to the modern Stratofortress with 8 Pratt & Whitney TF-33 P3-103 turbojet engines, weighing 480,000 pounds, and almost tripling the combat radius of 8,800 miles. Although the B-52 was originally designed for long-range bombing, it was the addition of in-flight refueling via a loop hose that made the Atlantean a truly global threat. This strategic bomber was noted not only for its impressive ability to transport up to 70,000 pounds of weapons, but also for many records. For example, during Operation Power Flight in 1957, 3 B-52 Stratofortresses became the first jet aircraft to fly non-stop around the world. It took them 45 hours and 19 minutes to complete this legendary journey and prove that the United States is capable of dropping a hydrogen bomb anywhere in the world. Shortly after power flight, the B-52H achieved another milestone in 1962 by setting a world range record, flying 12,532 miles without refueling, going from Kadena Air Base, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan, to Torrejon Air Base, Spain. Overall, from 1960 to 1968, at the height of the Cold War, B-52s armed with thermonuclear weapons were in a state of continuous air readiness 24 hours a day near the northern border of the USSR, which included up to 12 sorties a day from various air bases as part of Operation Chrome Dome. A total of 744 B-52s were built in 8 main versions. Of these, 76 are actively used, regularly going on combat missions. However, even these titans will face a large-scale and expensive modernization with the transition to more powerful Rolls-Royce F-130 engines that will allow them to remain in service until at least the 2050s. Another notorious American bomber that remains relevant to some air forces to this day is the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. This is truly a universal fighter because it combines the roles of both an all-weather supersonic jet interceptor and a long-range fighter bomber. It was developed by McDonnell Aircraft for the U.S. Navy and entered service in 1961, shortly after which it became a full member of the U.S. Air Force and United States Marine Corps. But even more impressive than the F-4's number of roles is the number of aircraft built, 5,195 units, making it the most produced American supersonic military aircraft in history. The Phantom II was used extensively during the Vietnam War, first as a primary air superiority fighter and later as a ground attack and aerial reconnaissance aircraft. The fighter established itself as a versatile fighter, becoming the first U.S. Air Force aircraft to simultaneously use air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons. However, like other interceptors of that era, it was initially designed without an internal cannon, receiving the M61 Vulcan only in later modifications. Just 31 months after its maiden flight, the F-4 became the fastest, highest-flying, and longest-range fighter aircraft in the U.S. Navy, setting 16 world records for speed, altitude, and rate of climb. Shortly before leaving combat service in 1996, the aircraft was used for reconnaissance missions and suppression of enemy air defenses during the 1991 Gulf War. However, it was soon replaced by another member of our list. The F-15 Eagle is an all-weather fighter aircraft from McDonnell Douglas that made its first flight in 1972 and entered service in 1976. Despite a lot of negativity and attacks from the fighter mafia that this aircraft was too huge and heavy to succeed as a dedicated aerial fighter, this Eagle still rose to the challenge, becoming the most successful modern fighter and scoring 100 victories without a single defeat in air combat. In fact, even counting more than 50 years of aircraft lost to pilot error or accidents, the F-15 set a service record of fewer than 2 aircraft destroyed per 100,000 flight hours. This is especially impressive when you realize that of the 1,600 such fighters produced, more than 220 are actively used by the U.S. Air Force today. And the order for the latest modifications of the F-15EX Eagle II in the amount of 102 units has already begun to be fulfilled, gradually replenishing the service's fleet, and with no plans to get rid of this bird of prey. The F-15 is capable of rising from ground level to 65,000 feet in just 122 seconds while accelerating vertically. So if someone asks, is this even a fighter or is it practically a missile? You can simply answer yes. Although such stats are not surprising given that this fighter produces up to Mach 2.5 or from 1,600 to 1,800 miles per hour, F-22 Raptor, F-4 Phantom II, F-14 Tomcat, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-A-18, and even F-35 Lightning II, all these beauties are slower than the legendary Eagle. So how much cooler could a fighter be? Well, when the U.S. needed to add the destruction of Soviet satellites to its defense plans, intelligence showed that an adversary could detect and evade a surface-to-orbit missile launch, so the U.S. simply developed an anti-satellite missile to be launched directly from the F-15 and successfully tested it. In the 2000s, the U.S. Air Force began to replace its F-15s of various modifications with the F-22 Raptor, but reductions in purchases greatly delayed the retirement of the old Eagles and soon led to the latest modifications of the F-15EX. We know that almost all of you were waiting for this particular guest. The time has come for all fans of the powerful brrr. We're of course talking about the iconic A-10 Thunderbolt II strike aircraft, affectionately nicknamed the Warthog by the military for its rugged, angular design and combative nature, like its African namesake. The A-10 became the only production aircraft designed exclusively for the Close Air Support (CAS) role, helping ground troops defeat armored vehicles, tanks, and other enemy ground forces. Interestingly enough, the attack aircraft was literally built around the GAU-8 Avenger rotary autocannon, firing 30mm armor-piercing shells from a 6-foot diameter drum at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. At the same time, the size of one shell is comparable to a beer bottle, and the weight of the gun accounts for 16% of the weight of the entire aircraft, which is why when removing the gun for maintenance, the military is forced to hold the tail of the Warthog so that its nose does not tip over. Protected by 1,200 pounds of titanium aircraft armor, this monster can withstand direct hits from armor-piercing and high-explosive projectiles up to 23mm in caliber, as well as use a mechanical system as a backup in case of hydraulic failure. When developing the A-10, the designers created not an airplane, but rather a Terminator, since it was designed to be able to successfully reach the base with one engine, half a tail, one lift, and half a wing. And these are not empty words either. During the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Warthog Captain Kim Campbell suffered engine damage and hydraulic system failure, forcing the aircraft to be manually controlled in reverse mode, and even despite all this, she flew for about another hour and landed successfully. But even after participating in virtually every major conflict since it entered service in 1977, the future of the A-10 has always been a subject of debate. Military services and authorities have regularly made attempts to send this stormtrooper into a well-deserved retirement, but it has no intentions on giving up so easily, making it clear from year to year that rumors of its death were exaggerated and intends to remain in service until at least 2029. Now it's your turn to tell us what other legendary aircraft we haven't mentioned yet that have also remained in service for decades. Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell for more content like today's. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.